welcome to another episode of Managing the Problems of Daily Living. We're delighted today to have Dr. Noam Schponser from Otterbein University in Ohio to talk to us about managing anxiety. Welcome, Dr. Schponser.
My pleasure.
Dr. Schponser is a professor of clinical psychology, but he is also the author of, is it your first nonfiction book, The Good Psychologist?
Well, it's my third, but the first one that got translated into English.
Oh, what gave you the idea to write a book?
Well, I've been writing all my life different things. And actually, it was an event. I was in my office and suddenly I had a thought. It was late in the afternoon and I had a thought, I wish the next client doesn't show up. And later, on the way home, I thought this sentence held inside it the energy of a book. And I started to think about that kind of a psychologist. And I remembered a few months before, I had an actual appointment with a young woman who came in and said she was a stripper with stage fright. So these two ideas in my mind kind of came together, and I thought, let's write something about a psychologist.
It's an idea for a book, right?
Yeah, a psychologist who's treating a stripper with stage fright.
Stage fright. I think the reason why we wanted to speak with you today is that concept of anxiety. I know you've been written up. I read about you first on LinkedIn and on Psychology Today about the social isolation increasing people's anxiety during the pandemic. I know that that's been more of a problem for people.
Yes, we've seen it increasing more recently because of the pandemic, but that's a problem that's been increasing for a while, even before the pandemic. And what we know now, as the research is coming in, generally is that social isolation is a very strong predictor of health problems, both.
Well, and that brings us to anxiety in general, and specifically issues like social anxiety that people have that keep them avoiding, correct?
Yes, I think
maintain that cycle.
Yeah, I think when you talk about social anxiety, which is a kind of anxiety problem where people are afraid of being judged negatively by others and criticized and ridiculed. And so what happens here is that they tend to avoid social situations. And when you avoid social situations, one thing that happens is that you lose your social skills because you're not getting practice. So without skills, you lose confidence. And without confidence, you're more likely to stay home more. So it's a vicious cycle. And when you talk to these people, interestingly, what you find is an interesting irony that happens a lot with anxiety. So when you ask someone who's staying home, what will happen if they'll go to the party? Mm-hmm. They say, people will ridicule me and shun me and criticize me. And then you say, well, let's assume that happens. What will happen next? And then they say, well, I'll feel bad. And then you say, well, what will happen then? And then they said, well, I'm going to go home and stay at home. And then I ask them, well, what are you doing right now? Well, they're staying home. So basically, they prescribe themselves their disease as the cure. See? And that's the general problem with avoidance. It gives you a short-term relief, but it's a long-term prison.
And the less you do, the less you're able to do. And I know you speak of in the many articles that you were quoted in that exposure is practice. And we'll talk about exposure when we get to the strategies for managing anxiety. But let's start, please, with a definition. You talk about anxiety as having four components to it, right?
Yeah, I think what we know is that the experience of anxiety is an aversive experience of dread and apprehension, and it has certain components. It has, of course, the emotional component, which is feeling scared. Physiologically, you often see an activation of the flight or fight response in the body. This is the system that prepares us to deal with stuff. You see an activation. Cognitively, there's certain predictable thoughts that go along with the experience of anxiety, and they're usually catastrophic and negative thoughts, like this is going to be really bad, and it's going to be really bad for certain. And then you have a behavioral component, which usually is escape or avoidance. So when we feel an aversive emotion of dread and we feel our heart beating and we're thinking, oh my God, this is dangerous and bad, then we tend to run away. And later, if someone invites us again, we tend to avoid. So that's what we see when we look at anxiety: physiology, emotion, cognition, and behavior.
You also say not to hate on your anxiety, because at the origins of fight or flight, it's really an evolutionary opportunity to keep us safe, correct? And to protect us.
Yes, I think we have to understand that the anxiety system is a lot like the pain system. Nobody likes pain, but pain alerts you to important matters you need to tend to if you are to protect your health. Right? So it's the same with anxiety. It's evolved as a defense, as a protection, as an alarm system that gets us to tend to stuff that is risky, dangerous, threatening, and so on. So if I had a magic wand and I could wave it and essentially eliminate your ability to feel fear and anxiety, you wouldn't want me to do it, because without the ability to feel fear and anxiety, you're not going to survive that long. You're going to walk to the edge of the cliff and feel nothing. You're more likely to fall. So the system is not the enemy, and we don't want to eliminate the ability to feel anxious or scared. We want to learn how to manage it correctly.
Correct. Correct. I wanted to sort of dovetail into how to be alone with your thoughts, kind of the concept of meditation practices to override the anxiety. So we start with some barriers to that, and you say with neurological programming that part of our internal mental architecture is responsiveness. So we're always kind of on high alert.
Yes, our brain is charged with taking in and making sense of environmental stimuli. Mm-hmm. So we can formulate a response, so we can figure out stuff and survive and thrive and solve problems. So our brain is always actively looking around and trying to make sense of stuff. We also have a very large brain, which has evolved, to allow us to do a lot of great things. But it's a big machine, and it churns all the time. That's why human beings have a need for distraction and entertainment. No other animal, watches Netflix, just for the fun of it. Our brain is churning. Just like a large machine, makes a lot of noise, needs a lot of cooling. So part of our makeup is these endless stream of thoughts that are going on. And a lot of them are helpful and useful, and a lot of them are not.
Correct.
And I think the challenge is how to separate the thoughts that are useful and the thoughts that are not, and how to handle that constant stream that sometimes can become overwhelming.
Right. And you say they can fall into categories like worries about the future. So you may have a concern about money, but then you start catastrophizing that now I won't be able to support my children. I'm going to lose my job.
Yes. With anxiety, you often see kind of a domino effect. You often see a chain reaction that happens in the mind. If you explore this with clients, you often see, like I said, a catastrophic and negative chain of thoughts. And we may not be aware of all of them. We're just kind of aware of the surface. But in therapy or in reflection, you can actually become aware of the whole chain, and then you can examine it and do something with it. And so an example I ask a client, why aren't you going out to the party? And they say, I'm going to be ridiculed. And then I say, well, let's assume that happens. What will happen next? And then they said, well, I'm going to feel terrible. And then I said, okay, let's say this happens. What happened next? And they'll say, well, I'm going to go home in despair. And I ask, okay, what will happen next? And then they say, well, I'm going to be completely alone and isolated and depressed. And then I say, well, okay, what will happen next? And they go, well, then I lose meaning and reason for living and jump off the bridge. And then you can step back and say, so what you're telling yourself, in fact, is if you go to the party, going to the party will end up in your suicide. And then you can ask, how likely is it? And you begin to challenge these negative catastrophic constructions. That's part of the work. But I think for people who deal with the stream of worrying thoughts, a useful skill is to, as you mentioned, develop kind of a mindful mindset where you watch the product of your mind with curiosity. Because, worry is not a world event, it's a mind event. And your worries are not, your thoughts are not you, in the same way that the waves are not the ocean. They're a product of your mind. A part of your mind is generating it. And it's useful to get to know those stories with some curiosity and compassion for yourself, and just kind of observe. I compare it to standing on the river's edge without jumping in. So you can observe the river and kind of appreciate its strength and force and what it does and where it's going without jumping in. And we can do the same with our stream of thoughts.
So it's gaining perspective. You are observing. You gave an example of sort of the thoughts moving by.
Yes, it's a useful idea to observe our thoughts and kind of get to know them and see where they're going and what they tend to do, and what they're connected to in terms of our emotional experience or our bodily sensations. Knowledge is power, and getting to know your internal architecture is going to make you more powerful in managing it. And the important thing is to not believe everything you think. Because our thoughts, our mind can generate scenarios very easily that are very hard to duplicate in the real world, right? I can right now think of myself on a purple winged camel flying to the moon. It's easy for me to do it in my head. But that's not easy to do in real life, right? And it's not likely to happen. So once we realize our thoughts are mind events and we can observe them and learn about them and see how they behave, and then we can decide which one to believe and which one to pick and work from. If we develop that ability, as opposed to automatically run with the first thought that comes to mind, which is often an anxious, catastrophic, negative thought,
right?
We gain control over our internal architecture and our behavior.
Correct. When you speak about curiosity, you talk about, is this sort of bringing up bodily sensations as well? Like, what is actually happening? You become your own behavior analyst in that moment.
Well, yeah, I think you want to become an expert on yourself, But I think the curiosity mindset is interesting even before we go to the information it gives you, because it's a better, fairer approach than the worry mindset. Because if you worry, you focus on the negative that can happen. And it's true that negative can happen in any situation. But positive can happen also in any situation. So curiosity basically expands your prism and allows you to entertain. I wonder what will happen here. How is this going to go? This is a much fairer analytic stance than only focusing on what could go wrong.
Correct.
So the
That it's all bad. It's the all or nothing
yes,
phenomenon.
yeah, and that's unfair and inaccurate
It's
analytic.
inaccurate. Correct. It's
Yes.
inaccurate and unfair, and it sets you up for failure. And then, as you said, then you start avoiding, and create that vicious cycle. We will return with Dr. Sponsor, and we will continue our conversation about managing anxiety through meditation and mindfulness. And we will be back.
Staring contest!
You still got it.
I know.
Come alive with the forest. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Welcome back to a very special episode of Managing the Problems of Daily Living. I hear every day how much anxiety people are experiencing. We are here talking with Dr. Noam Sponsor from Otterbein University in Ohio, and he is going to share with us some additional techniques to address our anxiety-provoking thoughts. So welcome back, Dr. Sponsor. The next step in terms of strategies for success in managing our negative thought processes is to attenuate action. And what do you mean by that?
Well, my thinking is that when we're anxious, we often act from our emotion. And acting from your emotion is risky because it leads to error. The useful thing to do is when we feel anxiety to accept the feeling, and that's part of our experience. It's like internal weather. It's a real experience, and we want to accept it. But when it comes time to decide on an action, we want to wait and consider some other sources of information other than the emotion. So you want to consider your values, you want to consult your goals, you want to consult your experience and logic, and hear those pieces of advice, and then make a considered decision as opposed to an emotionally driven decision. That strategy will help, because many times you're anxious, but the right move to do is not to run. And your values and goals and experience and logic can tell you that, and then you can override your anxiety and act correctly.
Well, the example you gave in a prior interview is if you're a child and you want to hit somebody, you hit that person, right? Independent of the consequences. But once we achieve maturity, the idea is that we will process not only the consequences, but how we'll be perceived in the world, etc. How that will affect our relationships, our job situation.
Yes. So this is what we talk about when we talk about considered action as opposed to emotionally driven action. Mm-hmm. Because often the correct behavior in a situation requires you to push aside the advice you get from emotion and accept the advice you get from your values and goals and your experience of the world and so on. So I may be very scared of dogs, and I'm walking with my daughter and there's a big dog and my fear tells me to run. But then I take a deep breath and I say, I consult my values, and my values are to protect my kid. So I'm not going to run.
Good idea. That's good thinking. Another strategy is to breathe. And, I use that every day. I was taught that as a college freshman. And what is the benefit of breathing? I think we talked earlier about the physiological components of anxiety. So you're actually slowing down that increased respiration. You're taking deeper breaths, right? And
when we're anxious, our breathing changes. Generally, it can be subtle, but it's predictable. We either hyperventilate subtly, shallow breathing, or we hold our breath a lot. And changes in the breathing create changes in oxygen level to the brain, and those create symptoms like the dizziness and lightheadedness. Those symptoms are not dangerous, but they scare us. And now we're in a cycle of anxiety. So when you feel anxious, for many people, it's useful to restore the breathing, and focus on breathing and take some good deep breaths, and then just breathe normally. Make sure you're breathing. And a useful thing we find recently is that when you breathe, you want to elongate the exhale phase. So exhale for a long time, because that appears to affect the vagus nerve that connects to the parasympathetic system, that is the sort of system that's in charge of relaxing us. So steady, deep breathing with emphasis on exhaling for a
So
second.
are we counting so many times in through our nose and then we're exhaling so many beats out through our mouth?
Yeah, and people have different approaches to this. You can go something like a 4-4-5, 4 inhale, hold 4, exhale for 5.
Just a little bit longer.
Yes, something like that. Even if you do it just for a little bit of time, can help your physiological system reset, and the experience of anxiety will be attenuated as a result.
Okay. The next tip you talk about is sensing your surroundings. And that is simply you can feel the leather of the couch on your skin, right? You can feel the warmth of your hands on your legs.
Yeah, we call these grounding exercises. When you're anxious, often you sort of lose your bearing a little bit. You have a sense of that you're not quite sure what's going on. And it helps to ground yourself. And people do it in different ways. But one way is to sort of focus on your senses and say, here's something I see in front of me, and here's something I touch, and here's a scent.
So it takes you out of your head, right?
Yes.
It puts you back in your body.
Yeah, connects you to the reality and your here and now.
And
you can also just name 5 objects around you. You can take a breath and say, okay, here's a tree, here's a car, here's a building, and here's a street light. And just the act of naming some objects around you can ground you in the here and now and reduce the sense of disorientation.
I had a friend who teaches yoga told me at one point to feel the ground beneath my feet when I was on a walking trail. It's pretty remarkable how quickly it can stabilize you.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't get upset about being upset. You say that scientific data suggests that periodic disturbing thoughts are very common. I don't think that people appreciate that. I think there's some people who find that very concerning, that you would have concerns.
Yeah, I think there is kind of expectation in American culture that you're not going to experience any discomfort, that you are entitled to have a life free of discomfort. I think in other cultures, it's not as strong. People realize that, life is like a diamond, right? It's beautiful and precious and hard. And there's going to be negative and difficult emotions and situations. And I think if we step back, it's fairly intuitive, because nobody expects to do anything meaningful without suffering setbacks and difficult times. I mean, if you decide to be a parent, you don't tell yourself that it's going to be all, shining moments, right? So it's the same in general in life. And if you feeling bad, it doesn't mean that you are bad or necessarily that the situation is bad. Just feelings come and go for all kinds of reasons. Like I said, like they're internal weather, and they're part of our experience. And it's useful to accept that and to have some self-compassion when you struggle. So if your child struggles, you're not going to hit them upside the head, call them stupid, and think you're helping them, right? But we do it to ourselves. When we struggle, we often beat ourselves up. We label ourselves negative labels. We call ourselves names. And people think that, well, if I punish myself, then next time I'll do better. But that's a misunderstanding of how human psychology works, because we protect what we value. We nurture what we value. And if you call yourself a bad name, call yourself stupid, beat yourself up, you devalue yourself. And if you have no value, why protect and nurture yourself? So it's really important to expect and accept that there's going to be setbacks, and they are part of doing anything meaningful.
Not only accepting that life is imperfect, but we are as well, right? And that
Absolutely.
yeah. And the last component from this article is to seek your center. Being able to sit with yourself, to be comfortable with your internal world, is a skill that you develop like any other with regular practice and discipline, right? The more you practice anything,
Yeah.
the easier it will become.
Yeah. I think there's good evidence that spending time with yourself, sort of observing and getting to know your internal architecture and letting your mind wander, and is a very useful skill for mental health. And, in our culture, we're often distracted and we're often obligated and we're often on the move, and there's a lot of demands. And so this skill of doing nothing but being with yourself is often neglected. But that's a mistake. So I think it's important to carve up some time to practice becoming comfortable and with and knowledgeable about yourself.
So in addition to the work-life balance, where we suggest to people that they find activities that they enjoy doing, you're really giving yourself the grace and the permission to like yourself despite your flaws.
Yes, I think the compassion piece is really important here. When we see someone who we care about struggle, we have sense of compassion for them. Human beings are great at that. We have compassion for a struggling dog, even a different species. A zebra doesn't feel compassion for a struggling dog, but we do. And so that ability you want to use and develop also towards yourself, and approach yourself like you would approach someone you love who's struggling, with compassion and encouragement and support. Not with harsh punishment and criticism and violence.
I think that's a great ending point. So in addition to learning to be alone with our thoughts, that really, I think, upping the volume on liking ourselves and self-acceptance, ultimately self-compassion, in terms of what you're saying. Thank you so much, Dr. Sponsor, for giving us your time today and your expertise. We look forward to your book, The Good Psychologist, and congratulations on a great career. Thanks again.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate the opportunity. I enjoyed that.
Of course. Thank you.